You ready?
Yeah, let's go ahead and start this off.
Yeah, so we were talking about wrestling your expectations of the cEDH format and kind of transitioning from EDH to cEDH and how the two vary, so to speak. I'm Evan, also known as Zclan7 on Discord. I play and maintain the most up-to-date cEDH version of Animar Evolution and co-host a podcast with Greg called the Pass Priority Podcast.
Yeah, it's an awesome podcast. You should check it out on YouTube and on Spotify. It's just the Past Priority Podcast. Will be there.
Check it out, it's pretty fire. But we'll get right into it.
Yeah. Oh, I gotta introduce myself too. And I'm
Yeah.
Greg. You will know me as Curious Control. You can find me on Twitter or on Moxfield or really any social media. If you search up Curious Control, I'm probably the first result. I am hosting the Past Priority Podcast with Evan, Zach, and Dante, a couple of really close buds, and we're just gonna chat about Control on that podcast. But today we're here with Eminence, and we're going to be talking about wrestling our expectations. So, Evan, let's get right into it.
Yeah, sounds good. So, Greg, what defines cEDH for you?
So, to define cEDH, it's like you want to be playing the best of the best, right? And there, in my humble opinion, there are two ends to this spectrum of like what cEDH is. There's the ROG Psi, and then there's like the mono white stacks, right? Both are competitive Commander. Both are strategies that are trying to play Commander at a competitive level to its maximum power, right? And hypothetically, both ends of the spectrum are winning games 25% of the time. But it shows that not every like cEDH deck has to be the Grixis Naz pile, the average mana cost of just over 1, and there are lots of different things that are cEDH, but it's just the mindset of playing Commander to its maximum power level is the core of it.
Yeah, I think a really good way to look at it is how do casual decks win? It's what the Crater Hoof Behemoth, and
It's stuff that
is
requires a
that it?
lot of setup. Yeah, so like Crater Hoof, right? Like, you know, in cEDH, you'd get enough mana to cast that Crater Hoof on turn 1, right? But, Crater Hoof on turn 1 isn't going to end the game. The real difference, like the clear defining difference between cEDH and casual is just like how long it takes to assemble those wins.
Right.
And like how compact a win condition is, because Crater Hoof Behemoth is, in air quotes, a 1-card win con. It's very compact, but you also need like 9 other creatures in play, and that's a hard thing to set up in a competitive environment.
Yeah, in cEDH decks, you can untap with 2 lands and an Arcane Signet and win the game on the same turn, which is really meta-defining, right? In how compact win cons can be and how efficient they can be. So it's just talking about how fast can you get there, essentially.
Yeah, basically, it's really just how fast your deck is. But at the same time, like stacks and control and mid range, those are things, and they're all competitively viable. I mean, mid range is a deck. There's a deck archetype where you could win on turn 1, turn 2, but also you have no problem just accruing value and winning on turn 8 or turn 9 when most casual games end. So there's just different ways to view it. But as long as you have the mentality that you're trying to win and you're trying to do it at maximum power level. You're not running pet cards. You're not running cards that are easily outclassed by something else. It's it's all cEDH.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. So if I'm someone who's looking to play Magic or Commander, why would I play cEDH over normal EDH? Am I looking to sweat through my shirt the whole time? Or am I looking to prove that I'm better than everyone else?
Yeah, I
No,
mean,
is the answer. But yeah, what is it to you? Why do you play cEDH, Greg?
so I play cEDH to um I play cEDH to win, right? I mean the goal is always to win. The goal of basically every Magic format and every Magic power level is to win. But I want to do it as flashy as possible, as powerful as possible, while still holding true to my values, which is control. So I guess it's not the most flashy thing, but you can go really far over the top with a Niv Mizzet plus Curiosity. Um,
Yeah.
it's it's just mean, Commander is CDH is still Commander, right? And Commander is still a social format, and a lot of CDH players get to the point where it's like it was the arms race that got us there. A quick comment on whoever just said this presentation sucks. That's kind of a sad opinion, but that's
Uh, you don't
yeah.
they don't like Rograk?
Uh, I love this presentation. We poured our heart and souls into this.
Yeah. But yeah, that makes a lot of sense that people have a arms race of why they get into CDH and play CDH because it starts as, oh, this person just got a new card and it's more powerful than what I'm doing. So you get something to kind of match that and it kind of just builds up from there. But I think a lot of people play CDH now because they like the environment of it, they like the pace of it, they like the mind games of it.
Mhm.
It's all these other aspects that doesn't really involve just trying to win the game as to why people like cEDH.
It's also like the most open format in terms of proxying, right? Like I've seen plenty of LGSs and casual pods that forbid proxying, just like even dual lands or something, right? But CEDH is very open because anyone who has like a fully built competitive list isn't going to expect a new player to dump 6 to 7 grand, especially with the prices of reserve list now, into a good air quotes deck. And so because of that, right, Siege is very open to proxying. There's no reason to gatekeep, thousands of potential players by saying, "Oh, sorry, no proxies are allowed at this game." Um,
I
I
think
mean,
that's what makes cEDH really special because you can play the most powerful deck in the format, quote unquote, right? You can play the most powerful deck in the format for $5 worth of printer paper and
yeah,
whatever, right? And that's I think a really special thing when talking about competitive Magic or just any sort of hobby in general is you can get into it for literally no money.
yeah. It's there's so many different ways to play CDH too. Like you don't, as I said earlier, you don't have to play CDH as the Grixis pile, right? You can play it. There are thousands of different ways to play CDH. There are hundreds of different commanders. Most of the time, you can look at Nagila, right, and you can assume it's winning through Derevi lines. But the other 98 cards in that deck could be a Nagila stacks list. It could be Turbo Nas. It could be mid range. It could just be some weird Winota Secret Commander Winota pile. Like, and all of those versions, they may be different, they may be kind of weird, but with the right mindset and the right card choices, you can make them CDH. Um,
Yeah, I think that's a really special
very
thing
simple.
to take a deck or an archetype that you really love and push it to its limits.
Hmm.
Whereas you're kind of frowned upon to do that in normal EDH because you don't want to push the threshold of power level that your playgroup doesn't like.
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense. Mhm.
So, based on your playgroup not liking things, what kind of social constructs do you come across when you're playing cEDH? Like what goes, what doesn't go?
You hold nothing back. I mean, so you shouldn't hold grudges
Hmm.
across multiple games, right? What happens in one game stays in that game. You shouldn't carry those emotions to your next game. Um, But if someone drops an Armageddon on turn 3, that's that's competitive. There's no social construct keeping you from doing whatever. Um, if someone attempts a turn 1 win, shuffle up and go next. I mean, it's CDH is all about the thrill of like, what can this deck do, or like what can I do limited to these 100 cards.
Hmm.
Um, and so like there's really no rule zero conversation other than we're all playing to win, we're all playing maximum power, and that's it, right? A lot of the rule zero conversations for casual are like no infinite combos, right? Can't run tutors, like don't run dual lands. Like I've even seen some people like don't play A plus Bs or reserve list cards in their decks, and it's like there's just so much going on, and it's not worth it. In my mind, that's why I play CDH maximum power. The only conversation you have to have with people is like, hey, yeah, no holding back, just go for the win. Turn 1 rule of law, turn 1 Trinisphere, whatever happens, happens.
Yeah, eliminating the rule zero conversation is really important because I personally kind of hate the idea of it in general. You can't just sit down and play Magic. You have to make sure everyone's okay with what's gonna happen, which is kind of a lame conversation to have, in my opinion. But when you play CDH, you can just walk in with the expectation that everyone's going to try to do their thing and win the game either the fastest or the most efficient way, or I don't want to say as quickly because stacks exist, but as quickly as possible.
Yeah.
So gameplay standards. When I walk into a CDH pod, even though everyone agrees to be playing CDH, when do I walk away from that pod being like, man, this kind of sucks.
This kind
And
of like wasn't CDH or
this kind of wasn't CDH. I think the point I want to make here is that if I'm playing in a cEDH pod and someone brings a deck that isn't very good or I think isn't cEDH, then maybe the gameplay standards are different. But they're
Mhm.
different. They vary from person to person. So maybe your gameplay standards vary from my gameplay standards.
So I think this is a scalding hot take that's going to get me canceled somewhere, but if someone ever walks up to a table and says like, "Hey, I'm playing budget cEDH," um,
Hmm.
into a pod of budgetless maximum power cEDH decks, right? It's like I don't think that budget cEDH list, like if you show up with a $500 cEDH deck, like sure, like you are going to win some games, but I don't think that's cEDH. I think that's just high power because with the sense of running the best of the best cards, like if you are not on like Force of Will, right? Because it doesn't fit in your budget, and instead of Force of Will, you're on Foil or some other counter spell, right?
Hmm.
All of a sudden you're running cards that are easily outclassed by something else, and it's like, is that really competitive? I mean, it's the competitive mindset, and I think it's a competitive deck with those other budgets, but that's one of the conversations, and that's one of the things I've seen is that people will play cEDH at their LGS, but it's like, this is my $250 maximum power cEDH deck, and it's like, all right, great. That is not gonna hold on. It's not gonna hold its own against three budgetless four color piles, or even
Hmm.
a bunch of proxy decks, right? Because I don't care about budget if I'm proxying my entire thing. Um,
Right.
yeah, and some people are very um, opposed to proxying themselves. So one of the most talented cEDH players that I know, he refused to play dual lands in any of his decks. He refused to proxy. He couldn't afford dual lands. He wouldn't play dual lands. But he played all the shocks and a couple other weird lands, and he still won a fair share of games. He was losing out on minor bits of efficiency for not running all those duels, but obviously it can happen. But
Right.
you know,
Yeah, because people aren't locked up by price point as soon as they accept proxying or when they accept proxying. But I think it's the real life metas is when people say their deck is cEDH, but it's really not. I ran into a couple times where I would meet people like at an LGS or at school or something, and they'll say that their deck is cEDH, but then I'll sit down and play a game against them, and I run into the default counterspell or the uh, or just like the Crater Hoof wins still, but they think just because their deck is really good in their meta that it's cEDH.
yeah. I mean, okay, you make a point about running default counterspell, but
Okay, I don't mean to say it like that. I mean to say it like as in
you
I run
hurt
a
my feelings.
counterspell in my deck, so it is cEDH.
Oh yeah, yeah. Any
That's
form
the
of
point I'm trying to
interaction,
make. Right,
is
any form of
competitive.
interaction. Yeah.
Yeah, that is not true. But
Or I feel
uh,
bad for counterspelling your thing because you're trying to do something, and
there's
that's just
no
what I've
emotion.
seen. Yeah, there's no
Yeah.
emotion, but that's what I see when I play real games with people that
Mhm.
have never met before, but they say that it's CDH. We
Yeah.
come to this agreement.
No, I never feel bad about interacting or doing anything in cEDH, right? It's
Right.
like someone is like, "Oh, here's a Naz turn 1," and it's like, "Oh, there's my days to stop you," right? It's not like, "Oh, man, I'm sorry for countering your turn 1 win attempt." It's like, "Get got, lol," and then pass the
Yeah,
turn.
get got. But it's Yeah, you shouldn't feel the way you should approach it is that I deserve to counterspell there because I was doing the thing that would win the game. So you can never walk away like, man, I can't believe they got me and not someone else type of thing.
Yeah.
Uh, what do you think about when you're deck building for CDH? I want to ask you that.
When I'm deck building for
When you're
CDH.
deck building for CDH.
All right, so I start with the win cons most of the time. So I sit down and I look at, okay, this is like how I want to win the game, right? Um, and then I build around that. Uh, Usually it's commanders afterwards, or sometimes it's commanders before and then win cons. And then once you have that built, it's like the staples, right? Your tutors, your counterspells if you're in those colors, your rituals if you're wanting those. Um, and then it's a deep dive on Scryfall for like, is there anything that no one else is playing that might make this strategy work really well? And I'll spend an entire afternoon scrolling through Scryfall looking at cards. I'll have like, is it a blue card? Is it like 2 CMC or less? And does it say draw a card? Thousands of results. I'm just reading through all of them because
Right.
I got to find every single possible. There are thousands and thousands of Magic cards, right? So you got to find what you need. Um, and if you
Yeah.
just if it's not net decking. I'm not stealing someone's list, but if I'm only looking at like 6 or 7 lists on the internet, right, and it's like I'm going to build my own deck from these things, it's like I'm not actually exploring the whole database of what Magic has to offer. Um,
Yeah, I think net decking is actually a really important part of cEDH as a format because there's a lot of people that I think every single deck that I personally built and I've seen other people build, it starts as a copy of someone else's deck that is proven to be good or okay or something, and then it gets improved from there. Um, do you have that same experience when you're deck building?
yeah, I have a similar experience with deck building.
Yeah, a thing I keep running into recently is cutting the fluff. Been
Such
a
a
lot of
hard job.
cards that people have been playing across multiple archetypes and decks that people are just like cutting the cards that I thought were staples for that list, even if I didn't play
Mhm.
the deck. And their explanation to me is like, "Oh, we just didn't need this," even though it's a stupid, really good card. I'll bring up Jessica's Will because that one I know has come up a few times, especially in like Rog side decks and Grixis piles. I keep seeing them cut it and add it back in and cut it and add it back in, and the explanation when they cut it is that it's fluff, but the explanation when they want to add it back in is that it's hopium. So I can't really decide what they want to do there.
Yeah. Uh, Honestly, cutting the fluff is a challenge because if I was just playing CDH to play CDH,
Hmm.
cutting the fluff would be really easy. But I've taken it upon myself to push 4 color control to its absolute limits and to
Right.
push control in CDH to its absolute limits. And so a lot of the times, like, I can't cut the fluff because I purposely added the fluff so I could test it out and see if it's actually good. And it's like somewhere in the back of my mind, there's like a mini Greg that's screaming, "This
Yeah.
card is terrible!" But I just I have to know. I have to play like 10, 15 games of it and get it out a couple times and see is it
Yeah,
actually
you really
good
have
or
to.
Inventive Iteration is the one card I jammed that for, oh god, a couple months, and then I was like, yeah, this card's actually terrible.
No, that makes a ton of sense. You have to test things to make sure that they're actually not as good as they seem, because
Mhm.
they can definitely surprise you after you get to playtest them for a while.
I mean, sometimes you find gems like a Niv Mizzet. I jammed Niv Mizzet for a little bit and was like, this card is really bad for a while, and it was like, oh my god, if you ever resolve a Niv Mizzet, like, how do you lose the game? Like, this card is just insane.
Right.
And that's like the one like super staple card that has stuck around since I first figured that one out.
No, I really like the Niv Mizzet combo. I think it's really cool and really strong, actually.
Yeah.
Uh, you have a random thoughts page. So would you like to tell me what you're thinking here?
Oh, yeah. So politics and gameplay patterns, they they're totally different from 60 card Magic. And this is what makes, in my mind, if you're coming from Legacy or Modern, and
Hmm.
you're jumping into cEDH because you want to play a competitive, but you also want to play Commander, and you don't want to go through the I'm playing regular Commander for 2 years, and you're just jumping from 160 card competitive format to
Hmm.
Commander as a competitive format or as a competitive end. Um, it's a very different game because in 60 card, right? Like, what is politicking in a 1v1, right? Like, oh, don't kill me next turn, or don't kill me this turn, please. Like, that doesn't do anything, right?
Right.
But in Commander, right, because it's not just a 1v1, it's a 1v1v1v1.
Hmm.
Um, if someone's like, oh, I could, like, use this spell to knock Greg out of the game, or like now do something terrible to me, I can show, or I can say, like, hey, if you do that and I'm knocked out of the game, right, you've used your interaction on me, and this next player will win. Like, they have win on board, or they have, like, half of it on board, half of it in hand, and
Mm.
it's really easy to say, like, if you eliminate me here, this player is winning the game, and unless you can deal with both me and them, you're just handing the game to the next player. And
Right.
that kind of politicking does not exist in 1v1. It's just impossible. And the gameplay patterns of, like, like, a Rhystic Study is a terrible card in a 1v1 format, or Mystic Remora is terrible in 1v1. Well, when you add two more opponents, Mystic Remora and Rhystic Study become some of the best cards in the format. Um,
Yeah, there's so much variation when talking about what EDH is as a format. It's impossible to get any, how to say, logistical data. So like if I wanted to play in a 60 card format, it's a 1v1, I can tell what my win rate is and what cards are really good and what cards got me there and all that other things. But if I'm playing cEDH or EDH and I want to know like how often a card comes up and how effective it is or whatever, there's way too many variables to be able to decide all of these things down to a T. I think a really good example of this is when you want to know if a card is good or not, right? So you want
mhm,
to see how many times it. So theoretically, you're thinking, oh, how many times does it come up, and every time it's come up, is it good? And uh, you just can't tell 100% all the time because of how much variation there is.
mhm,
Uh, I want to talk about how EDH is as a competitive format too in this regard, because I think EDH is a terrible competitive format in the way that you can't have sanctioned events for it because there's
mhm.
way too much variation. What Teferi Chain Veil won a tournament, Magda won a tournament, like these random decks that aren't considered to be the
The
best
best of the
decks in the
best.
the
Yeah.
best in the format don't put up or are the ones putting up the numbers at tournaments. So you have to wonder, is there too much variation and politicking and all these other things in competitive Magic that doesn't allow it to be a tournament format?
Well, the other thing is that, like, I think that Commander it's difficult to put Commander into a tournament setting. But what Eminence has done, pushing competitive Commander tournaments,
Hmm.
um, I think they've done a good job with it so far.
Oh yeah,
Um,
I agree.
yeah, but it is interesting to see and to hear your argument that Commander makes for a difficult or a bad
Tournament
competitive
format. Yeah,
format, because there is a lot of variance. There is a lot of it's not just how powerful a deck is; it's how skilled a pilot is, and
100%.
politically, right? If you can sweet talk somebody into making the wrong decision, right? Did your deck win, or did, like, you as a person win? Um, but you can compare that to 60 card, right? You could have two best, like, Legacy Delver or something. I'm not familiar with 60 card as much.
Yeah,
But if
shared
you have
legacy. Legacy
someone,
is legacy Delver.
yeah,
Perfect.
Legacy Delver, if you have one person who's, like, terrible at Legacy, right? And they're playing Delver, and you have someone who's played Legacy for like 15 years or whatever, right?
Hmm.
I'd put money on the guy who's been playing Legacy for 15 years over the guy who just picked up the deck. Um, there's a lot of experience, and I think that's what makes competitive Commander work as a tournament format.
Hmm.
Is even though you can't sanction it by Wizards of the Coast because whole mess of reasons.
Right.
Um, I think that variance is kind of nullified by player skill because it's just a set of
That's
talents you have
a
to warm up for.
that's a really interesting take, I think, because uh, you the theory is that you might not necessarily be the best player at the pod, but you'll still win the game because of how good your deck is. But on the flip side, you could also be the worst player in the pod, be playing a really good deck, and just have the win, right? Which is why I think that there's so much of a variation and not really a place in a tournament setting. Not to say that people haven't been doing a good job organizing tournaments and putting them together and
Hmm.
making a really good system for how to run them. Just that inherently a multiplayer format in the tournament setting is not ideal.
No, that makes a lot of sense because you can't force everyone to be smart. And so if you have one unskilled player at a pod and they make
Hmm.
a rash decision when evaluating a threat, or they fire off like an assassin's trophy at the wrong target or at the wrong time, or they
Hmm.
channel a Beseiju at something, and then it's like, okay, great, you just wasted this for no reason, or it's the new cEDH player thing. It's the immediate red flag that goes off when I can easily tell a new competitive player uh, when they remove a stacks piece on their own turn, like sorcery speed, remove the stacks piece, and then they immediately pass.
Hmm.
It's like, okay, great. Like, why would you go through all that effort to remove, like a Dranith, right, and then just pass the turn? Especially if your effect was at instant speed, because I doubt a lot of people are running sorcery speed, single target removal. But it's like missed triggers, misplaying the stack, um, threat assessment being off. All of these things are you can't control them in deck construction. It's a player thing,
Hmm.
and sometimes players get really stressed out at events, and so it is
Oh yeah.
hard to force players to be good and to play perfectly well. Um, I don't know.
Yeah, that no, that makes total sense because you could just have a gap in skill, and that
Mhm.
could greatly affect the outcome of games, no matter what decks are at the table. Like if you don't
Oh,
know how to interact with a Magda, you could just let it get to into enough treasures, and then the game's over, and they can just win over whatever you try to do. So it really is just a player issue. It's gap in skill issue, like you said.
yeah, it's a skill
At that
issue,
point, it is a
but
skill issue. I think that's a better way to put it.
the same thing. CDH is the most complicated way to play Magic, right?
Oh yeah.
Like Legacy is difficult, Vintage is complicated, right? But a CDH deck is basically Legacy Light, and then you have four Legacy Light decks at the table.
Hmm.
I don't know. You'd have a really hard time trying to convince me that CDH is not the most complicated way to play Magic the Gathering.
Oh, it
Um,
100% is.
and so, like, it takes a lot of brain power to be a really good CDH player. And, I'm an okay CDH player. I'm not the best. I haven't won any tournaments. I haven't top 16 any events. Um, it's like, it's really fucking difficult. Excuse my language, but
Yeah, it really is really difficult to because it's not just about you playing a good deck and knowing how to pilot your deck and being a good player. It's also reading your opponents, knowing what your opponent's decks are even doing in the first place and when to interact with them, when to go for wins and find your window. There's because you can't just do what you're trying to do right away. So there's so many levels of there's so many layers to cEDH that it's impossible to be the best player or be the master cEDH player, which is another really special thing because it means that there is no skill cap to cEDH.
yeah, 100%. All
I
right.
think I'm ready to take questions if you are.
Yeah. We'll open this up to the floor. So if anyone's got questions in Twitch chat, we'll answer them.
Yeah,
Talk about any topic that you guys want to talk about. Um, this is like I want to answer anything that you guys may
yeah,
be wondering about. Also, look at this lovely screen that Evan spent his class time making.
yeah. I really didn't want to pay attention, so I made this collage of images
Yeah. If you
of
could
both
name
my most
every
favorite and least favorite cEDH cards.
can you name the art of every one of these cards?
Yeah, probably.
Yeah,
Dargo, Ragavan, Dark Ritual. I won't go through all of them, but
yeah.
yeah.
I see a lot of them. All right. Well, as people are shying and not posting things in chat, let's talk. Oh, wait, this one. Um. Oh nope, that's just Hal being shitposty. I appreciate you, Hal. Um.
Is there something else you wanted to bring up?
How do we know some cards are fluff even if they've been played for ages? Ooh, this is a great one. Sylvan Library. Oh my gosh, that card is fluff in so many decks. But it's considered a cEDH staple, right? It's an EDH staple. It's got to be a cEDH staple, right? It's a very powerful green card. It gives you a ton of advantages. How bad could it possibly be? That card has been outdated since 2016. In my own personal opinion, Sylvan Library should not be played in very many decks. It's like Drago Rashmi Control can get away with it because that deck just wants as much advantage as it can,
Hmm.
or Sans Blue like stacks lists could probably be on Sylvan Library. Um,
I think a good way to represent this argument you're trying to make is if the card isn't actively either fast enough or good enough to help your game plan in
mhm.
any way, shape, or form, it really is just fluff. Either you have been playing it for a long time and just really like it, you have a fancy art of it, it's worth $200, whatever the excuse may be, it is just fluff if it's not actively helping your game plan. And I think a deck that really shows off when cards are fluff are things like Blue Farm, because when you have access to all the good cards in the game, anything that isn't really helping you just get to the win is kind of just fluff, right?
Yeah,
I think a really good example is I know it's kind of a hot topic, but things like Grand Abolisher effects, or not Grand Abolisher, but like Draineth Magistrate effects in Blue Farm. Blue Farm wants to turbo, it wants to get a lot of card advantage, it wants to do all these things, but none of them is really slow down your opponents, right? So running the Draineth Magistrate there seems like fluff, even though it's considered to be a staple in all CDH decks that can run white.
yeah. It's the staples that aren't you know progressing your own game plan, and so like Sylvan Library progresses my game plan, right? It draws
Hmm.
cards. How is that fluff? Um, it's it's 2 CMC. If you don't have it on exactly turn 1 or turn 2, it's just a dead draw. Like you never want to be drawing a Sylvan Library on turn 4. It, or like a top deck or something. Like if you have a Rhystic Study out and you're drawing cards hoping to find interaction or something and it's like, oop, here's a Sylvan Library off the top. It's the worst card in your deck most of the time. And because you don't see any benefits from it until your next turn, there are a lot of games where if you tap out to cast a Sylvan Library, right, unless you have a free piece of interaction in your hand, you're probably going to lose the game by the time you untap.
Yeah,
Um,
it's just the reality is for that specific decks or decks that run Sylvan Library, it just is too slow for the
yeah,
current meta.
but you can identify, we can identify Sylvan Library as fluff in the sense where it's like it's an it's like the backup to the backup to the backup form of advantage. It's really slow. It's been fairly outdated, and it's really not that great. But you can take that same mentality and apply that to find other fluff cards in your list. Um, One of the biggest fluff cards that I found in Curious Control was Ophidian Eye, where it was
Hmm.
like that card is really only good with Vile Smasher or if I have Niv Mizzet. Um, it having flash is like cool, right? Because you can flash it in at someone's end step and then untap and you have your engine going, but it's just kind of bad. Um, in that same sense, I discovered Jace Wielder of Mysteries, the 4 mana Planeswalker. I would use that to win games sometimes with a Niv Mizzet line assembled, or even just with Consult. It was like 4 CMC, blah, do this.
Hmm.
That ended up being fluff. It was outclassed by Thassa's Oracle, and it wasn't needed, so that card got cut. Basically, any card that is easily outclassed, isn't providing enough advantages. It's fluff. You should really just try try cutting it. Try playing another piece of acceleration. Try playing another piece of cheap interaction. Try playing, a land, and
Yeah.
just see how the deck feels cutting those cards.
When I first got into building my cEDH Animar deck, I was kind of net decking because everyone just net decks until they do their own thing, right? And it was on like these 1 CMC +1/+1 counter creatures that did nothing else besides that, and it wasn't on things like Rhystic Study. So you can just like in the past year or so, you can see all of these outdated cards, not just in Animar, but in multiple decks that just are really bad on their own, or they don't do enough for just cards that are just generically better. And I think that's how you can identify fluff, is if one card is just flat out better than another card, or one card just gives more value and does more for your deck than another card, it's the other card's probably fluff.
We're gonna have to cut this short. I have to run in just a moment.
Yeah, it's all good. Do you have any
But
closing thoughts?
closing thoughts. Hal asked a quick question: why do you force control in a format where it struggles as an archetype so much? Because I hate myself, Hal, and I'm trying to push it to its absolute limits. But on that note, you guys, thank you, Eminence, for allowing us to host this brief seminar. It was a lot of fun. I'm down to do it again at some point when I have a more free Saturday afternoon. Thank you,
All good.
everyone,
Yeah.
for listening. And check out the Past Priority podcast on YouTube or on Spotify. And we'd really appreciate you.
Yep. Thanks,
Uh,
guys.